morning, everybody. We can all start filing in and starting to get settled. Have a little material to make it through today. Everyone get settled a little more. Well, good morning. Let me see if I can do this, get this right. I'm Brian. He's a little older than me, right? Though we're about the same height. I will say that. If you missed last week, Brian was filling in for me. For those that don't, for those that might be visiting with us, I'm Jonathan. But there was a whole thing with Brian, I guess, calling himself Jonathan last week when I watched the video. I couldn't hear comments, so I don't know how that came about necessarily, but I know in the middle of talking I'm going to move forward. But I thought that was kind of funny when, as I was watching his class, he did a good job. I appreciate him filling in for me. We're getting back to our topic here. So God's design as a whole, but we had started God's design for marriage. So as a reminder, we talked about the importance of this topic, why talking about this, things like those that want to get married, they need to know what to look for, who to look for, what to be, who to be, so that those who are married know how to be. The fact that the marriage relationship is a reflection of our relationship with God. And of course, the thought that divorce in and of itself is terrible. We also talked about the unmarried. We spent a lot of time, understandably, purposefully, talking about how it's important that for the unmarried, you don't enter into marriage thoughtlessly. There's going to be some discussion of that again today, not necessarily pointed at the unmarried, but as we talk about husbands and wives today, it's going to be important that anyone who is not married think about these things, to think about when I'm looking for someone to possibly spend my life with, is this someone that I can expect to be like this? Is this someone that I can be? You know, as we talk about husbands, men, if you don't think that you can be all of these things with someone, it's probably not the wisest idea to connect yourself to to someone in that way. So again, these are thoughts that, yes, it's going to be primarily directed at those who are already married, because these are ways that we need to be. But it's so important that those who are not married, in terms of thinking through and not entering into a marriage thoughtlessly, that they understand what it means to be involved in that relationship. So let's start off with talking about husbands. Now, I have, I'll call it 6 sub-points to this first one, because it got brought up a lot of times, and so I think it's kind of important. Husbands, love your wives. First, as has been kind of a calling card, I'll call it, for this class so far, whatever topic we've been, I do want to take a moment and turn back to 1 Corinthians 13. When we think about husbands, love your wives, you know, again, what love looks like. I know it gets used a lot, but it's important that as we think about scriptures that we go to frequently, that we don't let the frequency with which we reference a passage allow it to become stale, allow it to become just meaningless words or repetition that we follow, that when we say these things, we still mean them no matter how often that we've talked about them. So 1 Corinthians 13, starting in verse 4. Love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Now, of course, in Titus 2:4, so there's going to be some echoing back and forth with husbands and wives. It also says, teach the young women to love their husbands. So this thought of love applies both to husbands and wives, and there'll be subjects as we get down into this that makes sense. But at the moment, focusing more on husbands, when you think about loving your wife, are you patient? Right? Are you kind? Or do you envy or boast? Are you arrogant with them, or are you rude? Do you insist on your own way in that relationship? Are you irritable or resentful? As you think about bearing and believing, are you fully fulfilling what this thought of love is when it comes to loving your wife? Now, there were 5 places I'm going to I think kind of touch on loving your wives specifically in this case. Let's go to Matthew 19:8. And as we get into these more, of course, I encourage comments, but I wanted to get some of this going so we had kind of a baseline start for our discussion. Matthew 19 and verse 8. And this is going to feel like a weird place to start when it comes to talking about loving your wives with this. But he said to them, so they're talking about the certificate of divorce, because of the hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. For me, the thought of keeping your heart soft in regards to your partner, keeping your heart soft towards them, I think, again, goes a long way. Now, there are 4 phrases that are used, and I'll list the passages. I'm not going to read them at the moment, but I'll tell you where. So, where it specifically says, husbands, love your wives. In Colossians 3:19, it says, love your wives and don't be harsh with them. In Ephesians chapter 5 is where the others come from. So in Ephesians 5:33, it says, love your wives as yourself. Going back, Ephesians 5:28 through 30, love your wives as your own bodies. And then going back, and there's a reason I'm backing into this. In Ephesians 5:25 through 27, love your wives as Christ loved the church. So here's where I'm going to, I guess I'll say, open up the floor a bit more. What do these mean? I mean, one seems pretty simple, love your wives and don't be harsh with them. But what do these other phrases, thoughts mean? As himself, or as yourself, as your own body, as Christ loved the church. Yes, sir. Flesh of my flesh, yeah.
So we're to think of our lives as the same inclination, same concern, same intensity that we show. I want to take care of myself, I want to be healthy, I want to have a measure of happiness and all that. So we should love our lives.
And kind of building off of that in multiple places, it says the two shall become one flesh, right? If we truly are joined so deeply with our partner, that natural consideration. And now, we have to practice it a bit more to get to the point where it's natural, but how do you build muscle memory? Practice, repetition, doing it over and over again. The heart is also a muscle, I'll point out, right? When it comes to loving someone as yourself, it doesn't necessarily come naturally at the start, but if you practice it, if you keep focused on it, if you engage with it again and again and again, it becomes, as you're talking about, that kind of natural inclination for the happiness of them, to try and care for the health. And I think those are also closely aligned, because if you're not caring for like their emotional health, their spiritual health, it's going to be difficult for them to be truly happy. Absolutely. What other thoughts about as we look at these? What about as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for it, right? What does that mean? Yes? Putting your spouse ahead of yourself. And I'm going to make one snarky comment, probably pointed more at myself than anyone else, but sacrificial love without becoming a martyr over it, right? If we truly love them and we're willing to give ourselves, was Christ, did Christ throw a fit about having to sacrifice for us? What kind of attitude did Christ have in terms of making an offering of himself for us? Yes, ma'am.
He was in full obedience to his Father, and knowing the whole plan, he was in full agreement with the plan as well.
And we know the plan for husband and wife, right? We should understand and be in full agreement and understand that this is the best for us, this is the best for them. Again, that I keep going back to that natural inclination that we make of it. Did you have a comment, sir?
Well, just to follow up to answer your question, Philippians 2 talks about his humility, how he humbled himself even to go to the cross. So that sacrificial love with humility versus, your comment about not being a martyr, that's kind of counteracts all this. That's not selfless love anymore.
Yeah, and I keep going back to, again, we use 1 Corinthians 13 a lot in those thoughts about insisting on their own way. Sometimes I know I have to get over this sense of fairness, right? I've done more today than you have. It's not fair. When do things? No, and I'm not even saying I'm not even saying this is vocalized, but when you have that even internalized, there's an issue, I think, again, personally, with attitude in terms of how we're engaging with that. Because if we really do care about them as much as we care about ourselves, as much as Christ loved the church, then really it's a joy to not insist on our own way, to be patient, to be kind, to not be arrogant or rude or any of these other things. Yes, sir.
Paul sees Jesus as the second Adam, and I think that the pattern between first Adam and second Adam is stronger than we appreciate. Because in one respect, although Adam does it under difficult circumstances, Adam shows solidarity with Eve, giving up paradise so that he can maintain his bond with Eve. And that is telegraphed in Eve's response, Adam's response to the creation of Eve. He says, "This is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh." That seems to come out of nowhere, because it doesn't seem to fit. But what it does is it telegraphs what Adam is going to do in later chapters. He's going to show solidarity with Eve, give up paradise for that. And like I say, it's under difficult circumstances, not just different circumstances. That's exactly what Jesus does with Eve's descendants. He shows solidarity with the children of Eve.
And you talk about that comparison and what Adam was also willing to sacrifice in that regard. Yes, well, but we have that. You said that parallel, that earthly example, but is also what husbands, what are you willing to give up for the sake of your wife? Seriously consider that. I mean, that's not just that is kind of a rhetorical question in that I'm not expecting you to launch an answer out at me, but it's something that as you engage in the day-to-day walk of your relationship, as you continue on, and again, for anyone who looks to get married, that thought of what do you have that you wouldn't be willing to give up for the, again, spiritual well-being of your partner? What would you not be willing to give up? Is there anything, should there be anything that you would not be willing to give up? Again, look at what Christ was willing to give up in leaving heaven to come to this earth, and what Adam gave up as part of this. What would stop you from loving your wife the way that you should? What? So the one thing we can't give up is the relationship with God, right? And I'm glad you bring that up. It goes back to what Debbie talks about with the plan and the importance of trying to find someone that is going to be aligned with you as much as possible. Because, and I really appreciate that, because that's going to get us to our next point here that I think is important. Any other thoughts on love before I take a step forward? Yes. Well, and again, in the entirety of talking about knowing the plan, right? If we don't act towards our spouses the way that we should, we are out of alignment with the plan, with the design of God, right? That's why, again, it's so important to think about these things as we get into them, because it can impact our relationship if we don't act the right way. Yes, sir.
Since we're not perfect people, regardless of what we think about ourselves, we are marrying an also imperfect person.
Yeah.
So, having that knowledge, we need to know each other very well before we make a commitment to life. That's the bottom line. I don't care what the background may be, it's where you're going from that point forward. If you don't have enough understanding of each other to know that, you're not going to marry.
Well, and again, I think that goes into a lot of this, is that engagement. As you look at these qualities, is this a person that I can have all of these qualities towards? Right? Is this a person who will help me act the way that a spouse should? Or is this someone that will drive... Again, the responsibility is on ourselves to do what we're supposed to do. But we at times make things unnecessarily hard on ourselves by putting ourselves in situations that can lead to us not doing what we should. Yes, ma'am.
The moment a couple perceives that their marriage is a 50-50 arrangement, it's probably in trouble. It's 100-100. There are times you'll receive 100 and times you'll be expected to give 100. And 50-50 is not an expectation, because then that's, I want my share. That's a selfish attitude. We have to be ready to give 100% as Christ did for the church.
Yeah, and that's as I mentioned, that fairness thought. You know, we can't have that thought of, well, that's not fair to me. We still need to be engaged 100%, even if the other person, as you kind of mentioned, is not even at 1% at that time. We need to keep going, but it's important that we try and find someone who can also be 100% engaged with us. Absolutely. So, all of this, and I think all of this kind of focuses us toward what I want to talk about next here, is husbands, strive to get your partner to heaven. Again, this is one of those that also crosses over to wives. Let's go over to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. This is smack dab in the middle of the discussion of the unmarried and not getting married and all of that. But 1 Corinthians 7, 10 through 16. So here we have, again, kind of in the middle of here. To the married I give this charge, not I, but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife. To the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister is not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? And I want to go over to one more passage quickly, and then we'll talk about it a little more. 1 Corinthians 11, in verse 3. So there's this kind of a leadership discussion that's tied to this somewhat. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Again, this thought of men as you take any kind of role in your relationship, your focus needs to be on getting yourself and your partner to heaven. Right? Again, it flows kind of out of that thought of love your wife as yourself. Love your wife as your own body. As you are striving to get to heaven, you should also be striving to take your partner there. No matter what, how they're acting toward you, we need to be trying to get them on the right path so that they can also experience the joys of heaven. Again, I want to emphasize this, that notice in verse 16, this is a both and proposition. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband, or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Again, there's always caution about entering into a relationship when it comes to, is this a person that you believe, one, that you can help get to heaven, and two, a person that you believe can help you get to heaven. It's an important examination to be made before entering in a relationship. Now, once you're in that relationship, again, it's very clear here that even if they are not as focused on the goal as you are, it's still your, I'll call it responsibility. I don't necessarily like the way that word carries here, but it should be your desire, your emphasis, your focus to still try and get them where they need to be. Yes, sir.
The passage in 1 Corinthians, stands about the head of the leadership.
Mm-hmm.
I can't lead anyone someplace that I'm not going myself.
Absolutely.
So the husband needs, it's been a whole long talk about, talking about husbands need to step up and be leaders. And that's a big problem with our society, is that men aren't stepping up to be leaders. So I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. I think a big problem in our world. But husbands need to be leaders. They need to be leading their wife and their children to heaven. And on that path, you use the word path while ago. If the path that I as a husband and leader of the family is not towards heaven, then how's my wife and kids going to get there?
Yeah, you cannot take someone somewhere you yourself are not going. And again, as a caution to as anyone who enters into a relationship, is that someone that you believe you can help lead to heaven? Because again, to Dennis's point to some extent, if this person is going to drag you away from obeying God. That's not someone that, again, ultimately you want to engage in a relationship with to start, right? Because you cannot give up the relationship between yourself and God for someone here. You cannot allow someone to drag you to hell because they are refusing to go themselves. It's the two sides of that coin, right? Any other thoughts on this one before we keep going? Yes, sir. It's a matter of, if God was able to save me, I have the hope that through me, that my spouse may also be able to be saved in that regard. It's a hope. It's a level of hope in trying to convert them, to bring them to the right way. Yes, sir.
So many times in society, unfortunately, they give these marriage vows, and they're just words. Drop of a hat, some of them go right, they want a divorce. When you give those vows, those words should come from the very depth of your heart. And like we were saying before, you have to give 100%. That's what makes it work. That's why it's sanctified by God.
You have to be truly and fully engaged. Again, I think that's why love is mentioned multiple times over and over again, is that there's a depth to the connection that has to be there. Again, in that comparison of to themselves, bodies, to the love that Christ had for the church, because you cannot let what you've said be in vain. You cannot let what it means to be a husband or a wife, as we're talking about as well, be vain for you. You have to be fully engaged with that. Yes, sir, and then... Yeah, again, I want to be careful in how I say this. There is a time in which you might be justified, as you say, to walk away from a relationship, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right choice in that situation. Does that make sense? We are given these thoughts because of the what can happen in that situation, in that relationship. But there's, as you said, there's hope for the future, that we might be able to have that impact on someone and help bring them where they need to be alongside us. And it's that it's not easy. I mean, there's a reason why we have these things laid out so clearly, why love is brought up so much, and why it's such attention to detail is given to it, is because it's not, it's simple, but it's not easy. And we need to make sure that we are fully engaged in it, or we're not going to have the hope, we're not going to have the focus that we need to have. Jerry, you had something that you wanted to...
I was just gonna say, a lot of the people in the world view love as a feeling. But when you read about love, it's all action, right? It's a verb, so it's an action. And when you go back to Ephesians chapter 5, the parallel with Christ as the head of the church, and that there is a maturity that's gonna happen over time, right? When we become a Christian, we're not mature. Right? We're learning, we're growing, we understand, but there's a lot of growth ahead of us. Same when you become first married, there's growth. So you have to be able to mature in that relationship and be willing to mature. And that's the problem with the world is I see people at work and they don't want to mature. They want, well, just put that one away, let's go find another one. They think it's always better. And it's like, that's not the idea. It's a working relationship that's going to have to mature. And if you're not willing to mature, then you're probably going to fail.
Just because you yourself might act immature doesn't mean you can't mature in that relationship as you grow. And again, fun and games and whatever, but you're right. It's important that we are striving together. Again, it's that thought of the church as well, right? We're all trying to work together toward a common goal of heaven. And I'm learning a lot on the way. I know everyone else, no matter how much we study God's Word, we're going to learn and understand more as we go. And same with there's a reason that relationship with God is compared to the relationship in marriage, is that there's a lot of growth and understanding that happens from us as we engage more in that relationship and grow closer to each other. I think Debbie, then Bill, and then... Okay, yes. Well, and let me address it maybe this way. When we talk about, to Jerry's point of maturity, it's knowing what to say, when to say it. Not necessarily always holding your tongue, it's saying the right thing at the correct time. Yeah, that correct. But that again, that comes a lot with the maturity as you grow as a couple, but also as you continue to grow in your walk with God, it'll help you with that. Bill. I would never argue that from my standpoint. a lot of it is trying to be as Christian as possible with your spouse, with everything that entails, as you talk about making sure that we say what we're supposed to say, what we should say. Again, the maturity that we have in the Scriptures will help us in the maturity that we should have in our relationships with our spouse. It'll help us to not allow those situations to get deeper than they already are, and to not fracture that relationship further. Sir. And then just this call out. This will be our last comment before I move us forward a little bit. I'm going to use that as a springboard into my next comment here. So thank you. Ephesians 5:31, it outlines this. It says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." Right? There's a separation that's made. It doesn't mean that you can't talk to family. It doesn't mean that you can't ask them for advice in certain situations, but again, ultimately it's you and your spouse and your parents who are them and their spouse together. I like that thought here, that the phrasing, hold fast. Right? You're not holding fast to your parents, right? It says to leave your parents. You're holding fast to that spouse. And again, that kind of goes back to if someone else, parents, whomever, is causing a fracture in your relationship, right? In your marriage relationship, you have some responsibility to address that. Any other thoughts on that before I move on to the next one? Yes, sir. Yeah, it's, again, so many ways going back to God's Word, going back to casting your cares on Him because He cares for you. Being engaged together in the work of the Lord is going to draw you closer rather than push you further apart. And so as you have situations that happen, going back in prayer, going back to the Word, and taking time to study together, to learn, to grow together is going to only be beneficial for your relationship rather than hurt it. And so many, when there's problems in their relationship, perhaps out of a desire to remain quiet, as the case may be, they get out of the habit of studying the Word together or talking about those biblical things. And because they're not going back to something that's unifying, it allows the cracks to grow deeper, to Bill's point. If we're not, again, going back to God's will as a couple, if we're not focused on engaging with every portion of His will and asking Him for help, it's only if out of contention with one another, we don't pray for one another, we don't study and help strive to get them to heaven, it's going to cause our relationship to get worse. Yes, sir.
There's a few songs here called Emotional Dynamics that
Yeah, the not going to one another, not kind of what I was talking about with the not studying scripture or talking godly topics anymore. Yeah.
Another one is, you just mesh with the other person, you seem to have your own personality. That's not the problem, but there's a problem there when you don't have a separate personality. The other one is to differentiate yourself and stand up for your values, and that's the only way you're gonna influence someone. And you work through that emotional pain, whatever's going on.
Can,
Just an example, if we're married and our spouse is growing spiritually and say, I'm a husband and I'm not, guess what? That gives me anxiety. And I try to shut that down. You can do that. I'm not saying I'm doing it perfectly.
we'll talk later.
So anyway, that's kind of a good example of where you can work out in a negative way when one wants to grow, that creates tension, and we want to pull people back down to where we are.
And I want to make one single word adjustment to one of the things that you said, if it's all right. Instead of standing up for your values, if we put the emphasis on standing up for God's values. Yeah, and I know you're coming from that, but yeah, and I totally understand you're coming from that direction, but I think it bears mentioning, because sometimes, I know, again, this personal reflection, we get stuck on a personal sense of either fairness or whatever it may be, and it's not standing up for my values, it's standing up for the values that God has instilled in me through His Word, through His will for me, that we need to be focused on to get one another where we need to be. Yes, sir. And it looks like we'll be continuing this next week. Well, and to again maybe play devil's advocate, we'll say, we seek out those buttons ourselves. We don't even need the devil's input to be able to find those buttons to push. Because once you know someone well enough, you have an idea. And I don't want to remove us from the equation in fault bearing, so to speak, in trying to seek those things out. I always struggle with when people say, devil made me do it. Well, no, he could have given the suggestion, but it was my own two hands, my own 2 feet, and often my own heart engaged in that thought pattern. Yes, ma'am.
We give our children two things. We give them roots and we give them wings. The roots must be given to them during their formative years, and that includes a volume of different things. But that has to be done during our formative years. And then the hardest part sometimes for some parents is the wings. It's harder than the roots. But scripturally, when they have those wings, when they sprout, let them lead and lead, as the scriptures tell us. And that's sometimes the harder part for a parent than the roots. But trust the roots that were given to them during those formative years.
And again, to tie into that, any roots that you give them are not to be roots into yourself, not to be roots into your own personal thoughts and things, but roots into God, roots into the church, roots into God's will, of an emphasis, a grounding. We go back to like a tree that's planted by the water, right? We're trying to root them somewhere where they'll be fed, where they'll be nourished, where we know they'll be taken care of. Because if they're properly rooted, then they'll be able to go out on their own. They'll be able to do these things. They'll be able to engage in relationships the way that they should, because in some ways setting the example for them as well in our own marriage, our own relationship, and how we engage with that.
A strong faith is included in that roots, among other.
I think this is probably a good place to hold us. We may not get to our final topic of this series, but that can always be held for another time. The next time we will continue talking about husbands. We'll touch on the connection with wives as well. But thank you all for your comments, and I'm